All right, welcome to this explainer where we're going to navigate the intricate legal ladder of criminal liability. We'll be exploring exactly how the justice system grades the taking of a human life. Now, if you've ever wondered how courts distinguish between, say, a cold-blooded assassination, a crime of passion, and a tragic medical accident, well, you are absolutely in the right place. Consider this your first-year law student masterclass in homicide. Let's dive in.
Here is our syllabus for today's lecture. 1. The spectrum of homicide. 2. Defining malice aforethought. 3. Implied malice in practice. 4. Heat of passion mitigation. 5. The reasonable person standard. And finally, 6. Distinguishing involuntary manslaughter.
Okay, Section 1, the spectrum of homicide, or as I like to call it, stepping down the ladder.
So, let's set up your primary mental model for evaluating these cases. It's a descending ladder of criminal culpability. As future legal thinkers, you can't just look at a tragedy and declare murder. You really have to look at the mind of the perpetrator. At the very top rung, we have murder, which strictly requires a legal element called malice. But as we step down the ladder to manslaughter, we're looking for mitigating factors or a complete lack of specific intent to kill. The severity of the punishment mirrors exactly where the defendant's mental state lands on this ladder.
Moving on to Section 2. Defining malice aforethought, the core element.
In criminal law, defining the core element is always step 1. What separates the absolute top rung from everything beneath it? That separator is malice aforethought. Now, don't let the archaic language fool you. Malice isn't always some premeditated, mustache-twirling plot. It can simply mean acting with a conscious and extreme disregard for human life. You knew the extreme risk of death, and you took the action anyway.
Section 3. Implied malice in practice and the subjective standard.
To really understand how implied malice plays out in practice, let's look at a tragic modern application, People v. Tseng. Dr. Xiu Ying Lisa Tseng was running a medical practice that morphed into something far, far darker. She began prescribing massive, lethal quantities of opioids, sedatives, and muscle relaxants to young, healthy patients, people without cancer or broken bones. Unsurprisingly, several of these patients tragically overdosed and died. All right, applying the Socratic method here, I want you to consider the facts. Does the doctor's reckless prescribing practice cross the line into second-degree murder? Or is this just a case of severe medical malpractice? Where exactly does bad medicine end and homicide begin?
So, the crucial point here is how the court evaluated her state of mind. The court concluded that it was indeed murder. Why? Because implied malice requires that the defendant subjectively appreciated the risk. Dr. Zhang had special medical knowledge of these dangers, obviously. But the smoking gun? After learning of the initial overdose deaths, she actually altered patient records. That cover-up proved she had subjective, conscious awareness of the lethal consequences of her actions. That firmly planted her right on the top rung of our culpability ladder.
And this brilliantly illustrates the dueling standards in law. Murder relies on a subjective standard of what the defendant actually knew and thought, while lesser charges, as we're about to see, rely heavily on an objective standard. What would a hypothetical, reasonable person think or do?
Section 4, heat of passion mitigation, where the ladder steps down.
Stepping down the ladder, we encounter situations where human frailty mitigates the crime. You see, the law makes a concession to the weakness of human nature through voluntary manslaughter. The law allows a partial defense if the defendant acted under extreme emotional disturbance or sudden passion. The intent to kill is there, sure, but the malice is neutralized by severe provocation. I will say, though, the legal hurdles to prove this are incredibly high.
For a defense attorney to successfully argue this mitigation, a very strict set of elements must be met. You need a sudden quarrel, the provocation has to be legally adequate, the defendant must actually lose self-control, and, this is the big one, there can be absolutely no cooling off period. If you have time to think, you have time to stop.
Let's test this strict rule with the Walters case. Walters and another man, Moore, got into a fistfight over a $10 bag of marijuana. The fistfight ends. Walters gets on his bicycle, rides away, retrieves a loaded gun hidden on a nearby roof, and returns 6 minutes later to shoot Moore. So I ask you, is Walters still protected by the heat of passion?
The district court decisively ruled no. They stated that because approximately 6 minutes passed, any inflamed passions should have been cooled. 6 minutes was enough time to escape the situation, calm down, and reflect on the course of action. Because he had time to cool off, the legal heat of passion completely evaporated, and his crime stepped right back up the ladder to murder.
All right, Section 5, the reasonable person standard, testing the objective rule.
What actually constitutes adequate provocation in the first place? To answer that, we look at State v. Gabera. In this case, a husband shot and killed his wife because she refused to drop misdemeanor theft charges against him. At trial, he claimed voluntary manslaughter, arguing that her refusal threw him into an uncontrollable passion.
Now, his defense team employed a pretty unique strategy. They brought in a psychiatrist who testified that Gabara suffered from an antisocial personality disorder, which made him subjectively more prone to impulsive, aggressive violence. Basically, they argued that for him, this provocation was unbearable. But does the law care about his specific innate mental traits?
The court held firm with a resounding no. The standard here is strictly objective. The provocation must be enough to cause an ordinary, reasonable person to lose control. The law outright precludes consideration of the innate peculiarities of the individual defendant. Think about it. If we allowed everyone's personal short fuses to dictate the law, the objective standard would completely collapse.
Finally, Section 6, distinguishing involuntary manslaughter, the bottom of the ladder.
Taking our final step down the ladder, we arrive at the realm where there is absolutely no intent to kill at all, yet a life has still been unlawfully taken. Here, the law punishes the failure to recognize a risk that a reasonable person would have seen. It basically criminalizes gross negligence. This is triggered when an unintentional killing happens without due caution and circumspection. A perfect, albeit terrifying, example is People v. Penny. In this case, a practitioner was performing a cosmetic face rejuvenation procedure on a patient. Unfortunately, she applied a formula containing phenol directly to the patient's skin, which resulted in lethal phenol poisoning.
The practitioner clearly had no evil design or intent to harm her client. She was just trying to perform a cosmetic service. But applying a lethal chemical without knowing the extreme risks or having the proper medical safeguards transformed what could be brushed off as a tragic accident into a criminally negligent homicide. The lack of due caution was so severe, it actually became criminal.
As we wrap up this masterclass on the legal mechanics of homicide, we've seen how the law uses these incredibly strict, often unforgiving frameworks to categorize human behavior. We've gone from a doctor's lethal prescriptions to a 6-minute cooling off period to cosmetic chemistry gone horribly wrong. So I leave you with this to ponder. How perfectly can an objective, reasonable person standard truly measure the chaotic reality of human passion, negligence, and malice? Keep that question in mind as you continue your legal studies.